They did not bury the last of them. There were too many bodies, and no one could agree where the ground was still honest enough to receive them. By the time the killing finally stopped, if it ever truly stopped, the small river town of Harlan's Ford had become a place that people spoke about in lowered voices, a place whose name did not appear in newspapers anymore except as a rumor or a warning. 250 white men. That was the number the state wrote down because the state needed numbers. But the people who lived there knew numbers were too clean for what had happened. But wait for a second before we continue towards the video. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe. The dead had come in all conditions. Some were found in the woods with their throats opened, so precisely it looked like a single red thread had been pulled from their bodies. Some were found in swamps, faces pressed into black water, boots missing, rifles gone. Some were found in their own homes, doors still locked, dogs still alive and whining in the corner, as if whatever had come in had not needed to break anything at all. And some were never found. Those were the worst. It began, officially, with a fire. That is how the county ledger recorded it. Plantation number 3, Walker Estate, total loss due to slave uprising or accident, cause undetermined. The ledger did not mention the smell that hung over the river for 3 days. It did not mention the way the smoke lay low and heavy, as if it refused to rise. It did not mention the boy who walked out of the burning fields with chains still hanging from his wrists, or how he did not run. The first men who saw him thought he was in shock. They said he looked small for his age, maybe 16, maybe less. He was barefoot. His shirt was gone. One side of his face was blackened by soot, the other streaked clean by tears or sweat or rain. He did not beg. He did not speak. He only stood there on the dirt road, watching the smoke behind him as if counting something inside it. They told him to sit. He did not. They told him again. He turned his head and looked at them, and later one of those men would say, under oath, in a voice that shook, that he had never seen eyes like that on any person, black or white. Not angry, not afraid, just finished. So they struck him, and that is when the first man died. It was not clean. It was not clever. It was not even meant to be killing. The boy's hands were still half numb from the chains, and he swung the broken length of iron more like an animal than a man. But iron is honest about what it does to bone, and the overseer's skull did not survive the conversation. The other 2 men shot him. They were sure they saw him fall. They walked forward with their rifles ready. They did not walk back. No one ever found their bodies. The river kept them. After that, things might still have ended quietly, if the world had been a different kind of place. But the South was not built to let things end quietly, and men were not built to accept that something they believed to be owned had decided it was not. So they formed posses. At first they said it was just to bring him in. They used that phrase the way people use prayers they do not really believe, bring him in, as if what had happened was an argument that could be resolved by hands and rope. The first posse was 12 men. They followed tracks into the low woods east of the river, where the ground stays wet even in summer and the trees grow close enough to turn daylight into a suggestion. They were confident. They were loud. They argued about who would get the reward. They did not come back. A week later, a farmer found one of their horses, walking in a circle with a broken rein and dried blood down its flank. 2 weeks after that, a trapper found a hat he recognized nailed to a tree with a hunting knife that did not belong to any man he knew. The state took notice. That was when the posters began to appear. They did not have a name. They only had a description: Negro male, young, scar on left shoulder, possibly armed, extremely dangerous. Reward offered. No one collected it. More posses went in, some with dogs, some with better rifles, some with men who had hunted men before and were proud of it. The woods took them, the swamps took them, the hills took them, and the river kept on keeping. By the time the count reached 20, people stopped calling it a manhunt and started calling it something else, though no one could quite agree on what the word should be. War was too large, revenge was too small. Fear, though, was the right size. Fear lived in the spaces between houses. It sat in the chairs at the back of saloons. It rode in wagons beside men who kept checking the tree line even in broad daylight. Mothers began to keep their sons inside after dark, not because of slaves, but because of one slave. And still there was no body. Every story needs a center, and this one never had one. No one could say where he slept. No one could say what he ate. No one could even say for sure that all the killings were done by the same person, except for the way the deaths seemed to rhyme with each other. A man would vanish, a search would be mounted, 1 or 2 searchers would be found, then nothing. Sometimes there were signs, a boot placed carefully in the middle of a trail, a rifle leaned against a tree, cleaned and unloaded. Once a posse found 3 men sitting in a rough circle as if resting, all with their throats open so neatly that no one could tell who had died first. People began to say he was more than one man. People began to say he could not be killed. People began to say a lot of things. The newspapers sent a correspondent. He stayed 3 days and left at dawn without saying goodbye. He wrote that there was a sickness in the land that had learned to walk. That line did not make it past the editor. The town tried to go back to normal. Normal did not want them. Plantations hired more guards. Then fewer, because guards did not like to work in places where the dark seemed to listen. Roads were patrolled. Then they were not, because patrols did not return in even numbers. And always there was the same question, whispered like a curse: where did he come from? The old one said it started at Walker Estate. Walker Estate had been a bad place, even by the standards of bad places. They said the fields were worked like prisons and the quarters like graves. They said men were broken there not just in body but in something deeper, something that does not show on skin. They said children learned to be quiet before they learned to speak, and then one night the main house burned. The fire was seen from 3 miles away. By the time anyone reached it, the house was gone, the barns were gone, and the fields were burning in long, crawling lines, as if someone had taught the fire where to go. They found bodies. Not all of them were black. They never found the boy. The people who'd been owned there scattered like birds. Some were caught, some were killed, some were never seen again. And one of them apparently decided that the world would not continue in the shape it had been. The killings did not happen fast. That was the part no one liked to admit. If he had wanted, he could have burned towns. He could have poisoned wells. He could have done things that would have made him a story told to scare children for 100 years. Instead, he chose men, specific men, men who hunted, men who owned, men who were certain of their place in the world. He took them one by one, and sometimes 2 or 3, and once, impossibly, he took 7 from a group of 15 without anyone ever being able to explain how. A preacher in Harlan's Ford said it was the hand of God. Another said it was the hand of T. He devil. Most people just said it was the hand of something that had finally learned how to close. The state sent soldiers. That is when things stopped being a local problem. The first detachment marched in with drums and flags and the confidence of men who had never lost to anyone who did not wear a uniform. They set up camp near the river. They sent scouts. The scouts did not come back. They sent more. They came back with fewer men than they left with, and the ones who did come back would not talk about what they had seen. They only said the woods were wrong. The officer in charge wrote to his superiors that he believed he was facing an organized group of insurgents. He was replaced. The next officer wrote that he believed he was facing a single highly capable individual. He was not replaced, but he did not sleep much after that. The number kept climbing, 50, 70, 100. The reward posters changed. Then they stopped putting up posters at all. People began to avoid the river roads. They began to avoid the woods. They began to avoid each other, because no one knew who might decide to join a posse and never come back, and still no one could answer the simplest question: who was he? There was no name, no photograph, no body, only a trail that refused to behave like a trail. It was as if he did not move through the land so much as appear where he was needed and vanish where he was not. One evening, in a saloon that had begun to close before sunset, an old man who had once been a slave himself said, very quietly, that some people are made in places like Walker Estate, and some of them do not come out shaped like people. No one argued with him. The killings reached a point where they stopped being counted in the papers and started being counted in ledgers meant for crop losses and storms. 200. And then more. The last official posse was assembled in late autumn, when the trees had begun to thin and the ground to harden. It had over 100 men in it. They went in with wagons, supplies, maps, and the confidence of men who believe that enough bodies moving in one direction must eventually find what they are looking for. Less than half of them came back, and the ones who did come back said something that no one wanted to hear. They said there was no chase. They said there was no pursuit. They said it felt like walking into a house where someone had already decided which rooms you would die in. After that, the state stopped sending men, not because the problem was solved, but because the problem had taught them that numbers were not the answer. Years passed. The woods grew. The river kept on keeping. Every now and then, someone would vanish near the old roots. Every now and then, a body would be found in a way that did not make sense. But the great wave of killing never returned. And still, no one ever found him. No grave, no bones, no proof that he had died. Only a story that refused to close its mouth. And in Harlan's Ford there is an old man who claims he was the last person to see him and live. He does not talk to newspapers. He does not talk to preachers. He only talks when the room is quiet and the night is heavy. And when he does, he always begins the same way. He says, "You think he was running." Then he shakes his head, and he says he wasn't running. He takes a long breath, and then he says he was hunting. No one knew his name, not anymore. If he had ever been given one that belonged only to him, it had been taken long before Walker Estate burned. Names there were things that could be changed, traded, shortened, or replaced by numbers depending on who was speaking and how angry they were. What remained to him was not a name but a memory of sound, something his mother had once whispered into his hair when he was small, and the night was still kind enough to listen. She did not live long enough to see him grow. Walker Estate I not encourage that kind of thing. He learned early that silence was safer than words. He learned that stillness could be mistaken for obedience. He learned that pain had different shapes and that some of them could be endured if you kept your mind somewhere else. He learned to keep his mind very far away. The quarters were built low and tight, as if the land itself did not want them standing upright. The fields were wide and open, and there was nowhere to hide from the sun or from men who carried sticks and worse. Children worked as soon as they could lift things. When they could not, they were made to hold things instead. He was small, but he was quick. Not quick in the way that drew attention. Quick in the way that meant he was already somewhere else when a hand came down. He learned the paths between the rows before he learned how to count. He learned where the ground stayed soft after rain and where it stayed hard. He learned which trees could hide a body and which ones could not. He learned the woods by watching them from a distance. The woods were not for them. That was the rule. Beyond the fields and the last fence, the land changed. It dipped and folded and grew thick with things that did not care who owned what. The woods belonged to nobody, which meant they belonged to danger. Sometimes men were sent in after things that had run. Sometimes those men came back. Sometimes they did not. He listened to the stories without looking like he was listening. He was good at that. There was an older man in the quarters who had once been taken north and then brought back, and this man knew things. He knew how to look at the sky and tell how long before rain. He knew how to step on leaves without making sound. He knew which plants could stop bleeding and which ones would make it worse. He taught without teaching. He would say things out loud to no one in particular. "Some ground lies," he would say, staring at the dirt. "It looks solid, but it will take you." Or, "If you walk like you are lost, people believe you are harmless." Or, "Everything that hunts can also be hunted." The boy listened. When the man died, quietly, in his sleep, which was a kind of miracle, the boy took his place near the edge of the fields and kept listening to the world. Walker Estate was run by men who believed that cruelty was the same thing as order. They were wrong, but it took fire to teach them. The overseer was a man who liked to be seen. He liked noise. He liked to make examples. He believed fear worked best when it was public. The boy learned where the overseer walked and when. He learned the sound of his boots. He learned how long it took him to cross from one end of the main yard to the other. He did not know he was learning these things for a reason. Not yet. The night it began, the sky was low and heavy, and the air would not move. It started, as many endings do, with something small. A girl collapsed in the field. Not fell, collapsed. Like a thing that had finally decided it had been standing long enough. They said she was lazy, they said she was pretending, they said a lot of things. The boy saw the way her eyes did not move. The overseer did not. He raised his stick. Something in the boy, something that had been quiet for a very long time, stood up. He does not remember crossing the distance between them. He remembers the sound the stick made when it hit the ground instead of her. He remembers the overseer turning, surprised, which was a rare expression on that face. He remembers the first blow he took, and the second, and how neither of them felt like what came after. They tied him. They always did. They tied him and left him where others could see what happened to boys who forgot themselves. The girl died before morning. That was not written down anywhere. Something else was. Walker Estate burned 3 nights later. No one ever proved who started it. Some said a lamp was knocked over. Some said lightning. Some said it was planned. The truth was less clean. The fire started in a place where the old wood had dried into something that wanted to be flame. It spread like it had been waiting. The boy was still chained when the shouting began. He does not remember breaking the chains. He remembers only that they were not on him anymore. The smoke was thick enough to turn the world into a tunnel. People were running in all directions, which is another way of saying no direction at all. The main house was already burning when he reached the yard, and one of the barns was gone. He saw the overseer near the fence. The man had a pistol. The boy had a length of iron that had once been part of something else. They saw each other. The overseer said his name, not the boy's name. The name the overseer used. The boy does not remember what he said back. He remembers the iron moving. He remembers the sound. He remembers the way the man fell. After that, the night broke open. People ran. People screamed. Some people tried to stop the fire. Some people tried to stop other people. Some people tried to stop him. He did not stay to find out how many did not succeed. By the time he reached the road, his wrists were bleeding and his chest felt like it had been filled with smoke instead of air. That is where the first 3 men found him. They thought he was finished. They were wrong. He does not remember killing the first one. He remembers the weight leaving the iron. He remembers the others shouting. He remembers falling. He remembers getting up. He remembers the trees. He ran into the woods without knowing where he was going. The woods did not care. The first day, he ran until he could not feel his legs. The second day, he walked until he could not feel anything at all. He drank from streams. He ate things he recognized and did not die from them. He slept in places where the ground was wrong and learned what that meant. On the 3rd day, he heard dogs. He climbed. He stayed very still. He learned that dogs can be fooled by water. And by time, he learned that men are not as patient as they think they are. He did not want to kill again. That is the part no one believes. The 4th day, he watched a group of men pass beneath the tree he was in. They were talking about him. They were laughing about what they would do when they found him. They did not look afraid. He let them go. That night he dreamed of fire. The 5th day, he found one of them alone. The man had wandered off to relieve himself and was still adjusting his belt when the boy stepped out of the trees. The man reached for his rifle. The boy was faster. It was not a clean kill. It was not a clever one. It was a desperate one. Afterward, the boy sat and shook until the light changed. He buried the body badly. He moved on. After that, it got easier. Not in the way people think. Not in a way that felt good. It got easier in the way that lifting something heavy gets easier after you have done it enough times, even though it never stops being heavy. He began to plan, not in words, in shapes, in distances, in time. He learned that men in groups feel strong and see poorly. He learned that men alone feel weak and listen too late. He learned to move in ways that left nothing behind, and when he could not do that, to leave things that meant something else, he learned that fear is louder than gunfire. The woods became a place instead of a wall. The swamps became paths. The hills became hiding places. He did not count the men. He did not need to. The world began to count them for him. He heard the rumors before he saw the posters. He saw the posters before he saw the soldiers. By then, the boy who had walked out of Walker Estate did not exist anymore in any way that mattered. What existed was something that knew how to wait. What existed was something that understood that some hunts are not about Esker. They are about removal. He did not believe he could change the world. He did not believe in that kind of story. He believed only that some things should not be allowed to continue in the shape they are in. The first time he took more than one at once, it was because they made a mistake. They camped where the ground dipped and the sound carried. They did not set a proper watch. They did not believe he was close. He took the one who wandered off, then the one who went to look for him, then the one who came to see what the noise was. The rest ran. He let them. He always let some of them go. Someone had to carry the story. By the time the number reached 30, he had stopped thinking of himself as a person who was being chased. He was not running anymore. He was choosing where, choosing when, choosing who, and somewhere far away from the woods, men were beginning to understand that something had been made in the fire at Walker Estate that did not intend to stop. They just did not yet understand how much it was willing to take. They began to call it a pattern. At first, no one wanted to. A pattern implies intention, and intention implies a mind that can be understood, and no one in Harlan's Ford or the towns that lay like loose buttons along the river wanted to believe that what was happening could be understood at all. It was easier to call each death an accident, a tragedy, a fluke of bad luck that had wandered into the wrong man's path. But accidents do not arrange themselves. The first 30 men died over the course of 3 months, and if you laid their disappearances on a map, you could see something like a slow closing hand. Roads that had once been used without thought became empty, small crossings were avoided, certain stretches of woods began to exist only in stories. The boy, though no one would have called him that anymore, did not think of them as the first 30. He did not think in numbers. Numbers belonged to ledgers and courts and people who needed to make sense of things that did not want to be made sense of. He thought in weight and in distance and in time. He thought in silence. By then the woods were no longer something he entered, they were something he wore. He knew where the deer crossed and where they did not. He knew which birds went quiet before a storm and which went quiet for other reasons. He knew that some places echo even when no one is speaking, and that those places should be avoided. He had learned to move with the day and not against it. He did not travel at dawn or dusk, when the light lies and shapes look like things they are not. He moved when the sun was high or the night was deep, when the world had decided what it was going to show. He did not build camps. He did not leave fires. He did not stay in one place long enough for it to remember him. The men who came looking for him were not like the men from Walker Estate or the first posses. These ones were volunteers, farmers, shopkeepers, men who believed that what was happening was not just a danger but an insult. They brought their own rifles. They brought their sons. They brought stories about how they would do things differently. They went into the woods and came out quieter, if they came out at all. He did not take them all. He never tried to. He took the ones who made mistakes. He took the ones who wandered. He took the ones who were too certain. One of them tried to set a trap. He used a wounded mule tied near a narrow trail and hid himself in the brush with a shotgun across his knees. He waited all day, sweating and listening to flies, and told himself that patience was the same thing as intelligence. Near evening, he heard something moving. He raised the gun. He did not see the man who was already behind him. The mule was found 2 days later, still alive, still tied, still waiting. The shotgun was found leaning against a tree, cleaned. The man was not found. Anoth. ER group tried dogs. The dogs were good. They followed the trail for miles. They led the men into a stretch of swamp where the ground looks solid until it is not. 2 men drowned. 1 dog came back without its handler. After that, fewer people volunteered. The state began to pay attention. Not in a way that was useful yet, but in a way that meant the words were being written down by people who did not live there. They sent a clerk first. He rode in on a thin horse and asked questions and wrote things in a small book. He stayed at the only inn and left his door locked at night. He left after a week with a thicker book and a thinner face. He wrote that there had been at least 15 confirmed deaths and an unknown number of disappearances. He was wrong, but not in a way that mattered. By the time the 20th man was gone, the woods had a reputation. By the time the 25th was gone, the river did too. Fishermen began to find things in their nets that were not fish. They began to fish elsewhere. He began to leave signs, not messages. He was not speaking to anyone. But he understood that men move differently when they think they are being watched, and differently again when they know they are. Once, after taking a man from a 3-person patrol, he placed the man's boots in the middle of the trail, side by side, toes pointed back the way they had come. The other 2 did not go forward. They did not go back either. They sat down and waited until morning. They left together. Another time, he took a rifle from a camp and set it upright against a tree at the edge of the clearing, with the barrel pointed at the sky and the sling hanging loose, as if it had been placed there by someone who intended to come back for it. No one did. Fear began to do his work for him. Men began to argue about routes before they even left. They began to flinch at sounds that had always been there. They began to see movement where there was only shadow. He did not enjoy this. That is another part no one believes. Enjoyment implies satisfaction. What he felt was closer to gravity, a thing that pulls and does not ask whether what it pulls wants to move. The first time he was wounded, it surprised him. A young man, too young, he thought, and then stopped thinking that way, fired too early and too wildly, and one of the shots tore a line across his upper arm. It was not deep, but it bled enough to make him slow. He went into the river and stayed there until the water took the color away. He bound the wound with a strip torn from his own shirt. He did not sleep that night. He understood then that this could end not in a way that looked like rest, but in a way that looked like a body on a road, and a story that would be told badly by people who needed it to mean something else. He began to be more careful. The men began to be less. Around the 30th death, something changed. The men who came after him stopped being neighbors and started being specialists. They arrived with better equipment and fewer stories. They did not talk about rewards. They talked about angles and coverage and supply lines. They did not walk in straight lines. They did not split up without reason. They did not camp where the ground dipped. The boy watched them from a ridge for a long time. They moved like men who had done this before. He understood that the shape of the hunt was about to change. He could have left. He knew that he could have gone deeper into the hills, into places where even the old maps were guesses, but he did not believe in leaving things unfinished. The first of the new men died quietly. He followed him for half a day and learned his habits. The man liked to stop and listen. The boy liked that too. They listened together from opposite sides of a small ravine. The man never heard him cross it. The second one did not die at all. Not that day. The boy let him go on purpose. He wanted to see what they would do differently. They did do things differently. They changed routes. They doubled watches. They began to move like something that knows it is being measured. For the first time since Walker Estate, the boy felt something like being studied. It did not frighten him, but it did make him adjust. The 30th death was not planned. It happened because a man tripped. He fell down a slope and broke his leg and started to scream. Screaming is a kind of signal. By the time the others reached him, he was already gone. They stood in a circle and did not speak for a long time. That night, they built a fire. They did not sleep. The next day, they left the woods. 2 days later, soldiers arrived. Not many, but enough to make the road look like a road again. They brought tents and flags and orders. They brought a man who had a real rank and a real uniform and a real belief that he could solve this. He set up camp near the river. He sent out scouts. The scouts did not come back. He sent more. Some of them did. They came back with stories that did not sound like stories. They said the woods were wrong. He wrote that down and did not believe it. He wrote other things down too. He wrote that he was facing an enemy of unknown size and capability. He did not yet write the word impossible. The boy watched the camp from a place where the trees grew in a way that hid everything but sound. He listened to the way the soldiers talked. He listened to the way they laughed. He listened to the way they did not quite believe they were in danger. He understood that the hunt had become something else. It was no longer about men who thought they were fixing a problem. It was about a system that had decided to apply itself. He did not know how long that would last. He did not know how much it would cost. He only knew that the thing that had begun in fire and chains and a broken length of iron was not going to stop just because it had been noticed. Somewhere someone would start counting differently, and when they did, the number would not be 30 anymore. They did not come like posses. They came like a decision. The men who arrived after the soldiers were not loud, and they did not bring flags. They did not ride together, and they did not announce themselves at the inn. They came in pairs or alone over 2 days, and they did not look at one another when they passed in the street, which was the first sign that they already knew each other very well. They were not young. They were not old either. They were the kind of men whose faces look unfinished, as if time has been working on them for a long while and has no intention of stopping. They wore plain clothes. They carried rifles that had been used and knives that had been sharpened. So often their shapes had changed. They asked few questions and listened to the answers as if they were sorting them into piles that already existed in their heads. The officer in charge of the camp was relieved to see them. He should not have been. They did not take his orders. They listened to them. That is different. There were 7 of them in the group that went in first, though they did not call themselves a group. They did not use names with each other in public. They had worked together before, in places where things had gone wrong, in ways that did not make it into reports. One of them was called Harrow, though that may not have been the name he was born with. He had a scar that ran from his left ear into his beard, and eyes that did not settle on anything for long. Another was a man named Pike, who smiled easily and never showed his teeth. There was a quiet one they called Reed, who carried a long rifle and walked as if the ground was a suggestion. The others were men whose details do not survive well in memory, which is sometimes the point. They spent a day not going in. They walked the edge of the woods and the river and the first hills and said very. They looked at where camps had been. They looked at where boots had left marks that did not come back. They looked at the places where the ground had been disturbed and then put back the wrong way. That night, Harrow said, "He knows this place like we know rooms." Pike said, "Then we don't act like guests." They went in before dawn. They did not take a straight path. They did not take one path at all. They moved like something that had decided to become several things for a while. The boy watched them from a high place where the trees thinned and the rock showed through. He did not know who they were. He knew what they were. They moved differently. They did not waste sound. They did not look where they were going so much as where someone might be looking at them from. He understood that these were not men who would be taught by accidents, so he did not try to teach them. He let them come. They followed signs. He did not remember leaving. That worried him. They avoided places he would have chosen. That worried him more. By the second day, they had not lost anyone. By the third, they had not even slowed. They found one of his old resting places, a shallow space under a fallen tree where the ground stayed dry, and Harrow stood there for a long time, looking at the way the leaves had been put back. "He doesn't sleep much," Harrow said. "No," Reed said. "He waits." They began to set their own shapes into the woods. They moved in a pattern that did not repeat. They watched each other's backs without looking like they were doing it. They did not build fires. They did not speak above a murmur. The boy felt, for the first time since Walker Estate, something like being crowded, not in space, in possibility. He took a risk on the fourth day. He followed Pike, not closely, not in a way that could be called following. He wanted to see how one of them behaved when he thought he was alone. Pike behaved the same way. That was the problem. The boy tried to set a small sign, a broken branch placed where it did not belong. Pike did not look at it. Pike looked at where it might have been broken from. They crossed a stream at a place where the water runs slow and wide. The boy went into the water and stayed there until the surface forgot him. Pike did not follow the surface. He walked downstream and looked at the banks. The boy moved away and felt something close to respect, and then stopped, feeling that respect makes you slow. On the fifth day, Reed vanished, not in dramatic way. He was there at dawn. He was not there by noon. The others did not call out. They did not scatter. They did not rush. They came together and stood in a small clearing and listened to the woods like men listening to a locked door. Harrow said, "He got one of us." Pike said, "Or the woods did." They did not find Reed. They did not find blood. They did not find a body. They found a place where the ground had been disturbed and then smoothed again by someone who did not need to do a good job because he was not being chased. They stayed another day. On the sixth day, one of the others, Bennett, the one who always walked on the right, stepped on ground that did not hold. It took him to his waist, and then to his chest, and then to his shoulders before anyone could reach him. They pulled him out. He was alive. He was shaking. He said something had touched his leg down there. They did not laugh. They did not tell him he was wrong. They moved camp. That night, they heard a single shot far away. It was not followed by anything. Harrow said, "He wants us to know he can reach out." Pike said, "He already has." They began to close their own shape. They stopped trying to cover ground and started trying to remove space. They moved toward a line of low hills where the trees grow thin and the rock breaks the soil in long gray ribs. The boy did not want them there. The hills were honest places. Things show there. On the seventh day, he made his mistake. He took one of them, not Pike, not Harrow, another one whose name did not matter. He waited until the man had put some distance between himself and the others. He moved fast. He ended it quickly. He did not see the second man until it was too late to pretend he was not there. The second man did not fire. He threw something. The world went white. The boy woke with his ears full of noise and his mouth full of dirt. He rolled and did not die. He ran and did not die. He did not stop running until the hills changed shape. When he stopped, he realized he was bleeding again. Not badly, badly enough. They had learned something. He had too. They were not here to be afraid. They were here to finish things. On the eighth day, Pike set a trap that did not look like a trap. It looked like a mistake, a dropped pack, a trail that went the wrong way. The boy did not follow it. He went around it. He almost did not see Harrow. Almost is not enough. The shot took bark off the tree by his head and told him where the man was, without telling him where the other men were. He went low. He moved. He did not find a way through. They had made a shape. He was inside it. For the first time, he thought about not getting out. That is not the same as being afraid. It is closer to being honest. They did not rush him. They did not shout. They did not try to close the distance all at once. They waited. They let the day change. They let him get thirsty. They let him get tired. He moved at night. So did they. On the 9th day, Harrow spoke, not loud, not to be heard, just enough. "You don't have to die here," he said. The boy did not answer. He did not know what answer would mean. Stood in the place for a long time. He did not feel like he had won. He did not feel like he had survived. He felt like something had finished a chapter without telling him what the next one was called. He left the hills. 3 days later, the soldiers found pieces, not enough to make bodies, enough to make reports. The officer wrote that the hunters had been lost in action. He did not write the rest. The woods grew quiet again, but not empty, because now the people who counted were going to start counting very differently. After the hunters vanished, the woods were quiet for almost a month. Not the kind of quiet that means peace, the kind that means something is gathering itself. The towns along the river took that quiet badly. They had learned by then to measure time in disappearances, and when none came, it felt less like safety and more like the moment when a fever breaks just before the body gives up. The officer wrote in his reports that the situation was stable. No one who lived there used that word anymore. They used words like waiting and holding and counting, because counting had changed. Before, men were counted as individuals, a hunter, a farmer, a volunteer, a name written once in a ledger and then crossed out. Now, men were counted in groups, a patrol of 6 that did not return, a wagon with 4 that reached the road without the driver, a camp of 12 that answered roll call with 7 voices. The boy did not think in these numbers, but he heard them. He heard them in the way the woods began to fill again with men who were not there to look brave. They were there because they had been told to come, and because the thing that had started at Walker Estate had begun to feel less like a story and more like a contagion. The state sent more soldiers, then it sent militia, then it sent men whose job descriptions did not exist on paper. They brought supply wagons and signal flags and tents that could be taken down and put up again in an hour. They brought maps that tried very hard to pretend the land was simpler than it was. They began to divide the woods into sections. They began to sweep. The boy watched the first sweep from a ridge and understood that he was no longer dealing with hunts. He was dealing with pressure. They moved like a wall that had learned to walk. They did not chase him. They displaced him. They made places uninhabitable. They made waiting difficult. He adapted. He always had. He stopped thinking in terms of days and started thinking in terms of flows. Where the men were thickest, where they were thinnest, where they believed the land was empty and therefore did not look closely. He began to use their own movement against them. Once, he watched a unit move through a narrow valley and waited until they were halfway in before he took the last man. The others heard something and turned. They did not see him. They did not see the body either until they backed into it. They fired. They shouted. They called for support. Another unit came running. By the time they realized they were shooting at echoes and shadows, 3 more men were gone. He did not stay. He never stayed. Another time he led a patrol into a place where the ground looks dry, but is not. They lost 2 men and most of their confidence. Word spread, not in newspapers, in glances, in how men held their rifles, in how often they checked behind themselves. The number crossed 100 without anyone marking the moment. It was noticed afterward the way people notice that a storm has become a flood only when the water is already in the house. The officer was replaced. The next one stayed behind desks more. The next one, after that, did not sleep. They started building fortified camps. They started stringing wire between trees. They started setting traps that were meant for people, not animals. Some of those traps worked. The boy learned to spot them. Some of them worked too well. A militia unit found 3 of their own men in one of their own pits, and no one could explain how they had fallen in. That was the first time the word impossible appeared in a report. It was crossed out and replaced with unlikely. It should not have been. The boy was wounded again, a glancing shot that tore into his side and burned like fire for days. He hid in a place where the rock forms a shallow cave and the rain does not reach. He did not move for 2 days. He listened to men walk past him. He listened to them talk about him as if he were weather. On the 3rd night, he crawled out and left them 1 fewer. He did not know if he was winning. He did not think in those terms. He only knew that the thing that had begun could not stop while it still recognized itself. The men began to burn parts of the woods, not big fires, controlled ones. They said it was to clear undergrowth. It was also to make hiding harder. It worked, and then it did not. Fire changes the land. So does someone who has lived with fire. The boy began to move through burned places where the ash kept prints better than dirt. He began to leave false trails. He began to use the smoke. The number crossed 150 in the late summer. That was when people stopped pretending this was a law problem. They started calling it something else. They did not call it a war. That would have meant admitting that the other side had a face. They called it an emergency. They called it a crisis. They called it a situation. But men began to die like soldiers. Units went in and did not come out. Units came out wrong. There was a night when a camp of 30 was hit in 3 places at once. No one could explain how. The boy did not explain. He had learned to move in ways that looked like more than one person. He had learned to let the dark do some of the work. He had learned that people believe what frightens them most. By autumn, the number was past 200. The river carried things again. The towns closed in on themselves. Trade slowed. Roads emptied. Men stopped traveling alone. Then they stopped traveling at all. The boy began to feel the weight of it. Not guilt, not pride. Weight. He was tired in a way that sleep does not fix. He was thinner. He was slower. He knew it. He also knew that slowing did not mean stopping. There was a night when he was almost caught. A net of men closed around a stand of trees faster than he expected. He ran. He was shot at. He was hit. Not badly, badly enough. He threw himself into the river and let it take him. Downstream, a unit found blood and nothing else. They reported a probable kill. They were wrong. 2 weeks later, 5 men disappeared from a patrol that should not have been vulnerable. The word impossible came back. This time, no one crossed it out. By the time the count reached 210, the state stopped publishing numbers. By the time it reached 220, people started lying about how many men were going in. By the time it reached 230, the boy stopped trying to remember faces. He did not want them anymore. There was a night when he sat in a tree and watched a convoy of wagons move along a road that had been cleared twice already. He did not attack. He did not have the strength. He let them pass. That scared him more than anything else had, because it meant he was changing again. The next morning, he walked into a camp and took 3 men before anyone understood what was happening. He left a knife stuck in a map. The map was wrong. Someone finally shot him in a way that mattered. The bullet went through his shoulder and into the muscle behind it. He could still move, but not well. He disappeared into a place where the hills break into stone and the paths become guesses. Behind him, the state gathered everything it had left to gather. Men, guns, dogs, they called it. The last effort. They said that a thing like this must have an end. They were right. They were just wrong about what the end would look like. Because the count was about to surge, and when it did, it would no longer be possible to pretend this was anything but a war. They called it the final sweep. They did not put that in writing. On paper, it was a coordinated containment and elimination operation involving state troops, militia, volunteers, and special auxiliaries. On paper, it had arrows and boundaries and timetables. In the mouths of the men who were told to take part in it, it was simpler. They were going to end it. They gathered for 3 days. Wagons arrived from places that did not usually send wagons. Men arrived who did not usually wear uniforms. Dogs arrived in cages. Barrels of powder and crates of ammunition were stacked under canvas. Maps were laid out and argued over, and then laid out again. The hills where the boy had gone were not large. That was the thinking. They were broken and ugly and full of stone, but they were not large. There were only so many places a man could hide, only so many directions he could run. This time they would not chase. This time they would close. They moved before dawn on the 4th day, from 3 sides, then 4, then 5. A slow, careful tightening. More than 100 men went in. Some said closer to 150. No one ever agreed on the exact number, which is how you can tell it was too many to count properly. The boy felt them before he saw them. The land began to change its sound. That is something you only learn if you have lived in one place long enough and listen to it when nothing is happening. The wind does not move the same way when there are that many bodies interrupting it. Birds leave, insects go quiet, even the ground seems to hold itself differently. He was weak. Not in the way that makes you lie down and wait to die, in the way that makes every decision cost more. His shoulder burned. His side still pulled when he moved wrong. He had not eaten enough. He had not slept enough. He did not think he would survive this by running, so he did not try. He began to think in terms of shapes again, in terms of breaking lines instead of crossing them. The first contact happened when a militia unit moved too fast and lost its spacing. The boy was not even sure he had meant to take them. They came over a rise in a way that put the sun behind them and their shadows ahead, and he saw the mistake before they did. He took the first one and let the others see it. They fired. They shouted. They fell back in the wrong direction. Another unit heard them and moved in. Then another. Within an hour, there were men running in 3 different directions, shooting at things that were not there. By noon, 12 were dead. By evening, more. The commanders tried to restore order. They sent runners, they blew whistles, they fired signal shots. The hills took the sound and gave it back broken. The boy moved through the spaces they created, not fast, carefully. He did not attack camps. He did not attack lines. He attacked moments, the place where 2 units almost met, but did not, the place where a watch changed, and both men thought the other one was still looking, the place where someone went to get water and did not come back. By the second day, the count was already past 20. They did not write that down. They were still telling themselves this was the beginning. On the 3rd day, the dogs reached him, not all at once, 1 pair first. He heard them long before he saw them. He went into a place where the stone breaks the ground into shelves and narrow cuts. He moved where man can move, but a dog has to think. They lost 1 dog. They lost the handler too. The others pulled back. They brought more dogs. They brought more men. They began to burn. Not small, careful fires, real ones. They set whole. Slopes alight. Smoke lay in the valleys like a second ground. The boy moved through it with his face wrapped in cloth, and his eyes burning and his lungs screaming. He took 3 men out of a burning stand of trees and left the rest coughing and blind. They began to say his name in camp, not a real name, a word, a thing. They began to say he was everywhere. They began to say he could not be hit. Someone did hit him, a shot that took part of his ear and left him hearing the world wrong afterward. He did not stop. He could not afford to. On the 4th night, something broke. A militia unit mistook another militia unit for him. They fired into each other at close range. By the time someone realized what was happening, 9 men were down. The boy was not even there. The fear was, the commanders tried to pull units back. Some came, some did not, some could not be found. The hills had become a maze made of men. On the 5th day the rain came, not a gentle rain, a hard one. The kind that turns ash into mud and paths into lies. It washed tracks away. It filled cuts and low places. It made rifles unreliable and tempers short. The boy used it. He moved along a ridge and dropped into 3 different positions over the course of the day, taking 1 or 2 men from each and then being gone before anyone could be sure where the shots had come from. By nightfall, the count was somewhere past 50. No one would say that out loud. They said things like heavy losses. They said things like unacceptable. They said things like tomorrow. Tomorrow was worse. On the 6th day, a full company tried to push through a narrow valley at the same time. It was the worst possible decision. The valley bent in a way that hides its center from both ends. The boy waited in that bend. He did not know how long he waited. Time was no longer something that behaved. When the men were halfway through, he took 1, then another. Then he did not take anyone for a long time. He let them compress, he let them shout, he let them fire into rock and shadow. Then he took 2 more, then he disappeared up a side cut that only someone who had fallen into it before would know about. They did not lose just the 4 men he took. They lost the shape of themselves. They came out of that valley in pieces. By the end of the day, the count was past 70. That night, there was almost a mutiny. Men refused to go back in. Some officers threatened them. Some begged, some said nothing and packed their things. The boy listened to this from a place where the wind carried voices. He did not feel triumph. He felt something like the edge of a cliff. On the 7th day, they tried something new. They stopped pushing. They started waiting. They set up a wide ring and sat in it. They said they would starve him out. They said he could not be everywhere. They were right, but he did not need to be. That night, he moved through a place where 2 sections of the ring almost touched but did not quite. He took 1 man from one side and 1 from the other and left their bodies where they would be found in the morning. The ring loosened. Fear does that. On the 8th day, the boy could barely lift his arm. His shoulder had swollen and gone hot. He was moving on will, and something harder than will. He walked into a place where the rock opened into a long sloping corridor and sat down and thought. for the first time, about not getting up again. Then he heard voices. He stood up. He took 2 men and did not remember doing it. He walked away and did not remember how, by the 9th day, the count had passed 90. They stopped counting individuals. They started counting days. They said things like, "We lost another dozen." They said things like, "We can't hold this." The commanders met. They argued. They decided to push everything they had left into one final closing movement. The boy felt it coming. The hills felt it too. Ooh. Everything was being driven toward one place, a bowl of land where the rock walls curve inward and the ground is mostly bare. If he went there, there would be no cover. If he did not, he would be cut off. He went there. The 10th day was the worst. They came from 3 sides at once. They did not hesitate. They did not try to be careful. They fired and moved and fired again. The boy ran. He was hit. Not badly. Badly enough. He fell and got up and fell again and got up again. He used the rock. He used the echoes. He used the way men shoot at where they think someone is. He took 5, then 3, then 2. Then he did not know. He reached the far side of the bowl and threw himself into a narrow crack that opens into a long sloping passage that only exists if you already know it does. They followed him, some of them, not all. They could not fit. They came in pieces. He took the first 2 in the dark. He took another at the turn. He did not take the last one. He left him screaming. When he came out the other side, the world was very quiet. The sweep did not end that day, but it broke. Men began to leave. Units began to pull back. By the time the hills were empty again, more than 100 men were not coming out. Some said 103, some said 112, some said more. No one ever agreed. The boy did not know the number. He only knew that when he reached a place where the ground finally leveled and the trees came back, he lay down and did not move for a very long time. Behind him, the greatest hunt the state had ever assembled was being called something else, a disaster, a failure, a tragedy. And the people who counted were discovering that the number they were about to write down was larger than anyone had ever believed possible. After the sweep failed, the hills were quiet in a way that felt like a lie. The men who came out did not come out together. They came in small groups, or alone, or not at all. Some walked, some were carried, some were sent down on wagons with canvas pulled over shapes that did not need to be seen to be understood. The officer wrote a report. Then he wrote another one that corrected the first. Then he stopped writing for 3 days. The state did not announce numbers. It announced changes in command. It announced new measures. It announced that the situation was being reassessed. In the towns, people announced nothing. They watched the roads and counted wagons. The boy did not know any of this. For a time that he could not measure, he lay in a place where the ground sloped gently and the trees broke the wind. He drifted in and out of something that was not sleep and not waking. His shoulder had gone stiff and hot. His side burned when he breathed wrong. His ear rang all the time now, as if the world had decided to keep a reminder of what it could do. He did not dream. When he finally stood, he did not feel like standing meant anything. He moved because not moving had begun to feel like dying. He did not go back into the hills. He went down, toward the river, toward places that had been walked by men for so long that they believed nothing could surprise them there anymore. The state pulled back, not completely, but enough that the shape of the pressure changed. They stopped trying to close the land like a fist. They started trying to hold it like a net. Checkpoints went up on roads. Bridges were watched. Wagons were searched. Patrols walked the edges of towns and did not go far into the trees. They said he could not get through. He did not argue. He went around. The killings did not resume all at once. They returned like weather. A man missing from a riverside patrol, 2 men found in a stand of trees that had been walked 100 times before, a wagon that arrived without its driver. The numbers began to climb again, slower at first, and then faster. The state tried to control information. T worked in places where people wanted to believe. It did not work where people could count. By the time the count reached 180, the word war began to appear in letters that were never meant to be published. It did not appear in newspapers. It appeared in notes between men who were tired of pretending. The boy did not know the number. He had stopped thinking in numbers a long time ago. He thought in terms of whether the land still had places for him, whether his body still answered when he asked it to move, whether the thing that had begun in fire was still moving forward or had begun to circle. He was thinner. He was slower. He was also quieter. He began to take men in places where no one expected him anymore, near farms, near roads, near the edges of towns, where dogs bark at night, and people tell themselves it is nothing. Once he walked through a place that had been turned into a temporary barracks and took a man from a tent that had 3 men sleeping in it. The other 2 did not wake up. Another time, he took a man from a bridge in the early morning and left his body where the first wagon of the day would find it. That road was closed for a week. The fear changed again. It stopped being sharp. It became heavy. People did not talk about him as much. They talked about leaving. Some did, some could not. The state tried to bring in new men. Some refused. Some came and did not stay. The number crossed 200 without ceremony. It was noticed afterward, the way people noticed that they have passed a place they were afraid of reaching. There was a man named Elridge who lived in a small house near a bend in the river where the trees come close to the water. He had been a ferryman once, and before that he had been owned, and before that he had been a boy whose name no one remembered correctly. He did not leave. He did not join patrols. He did not carry a rifle. He watched the river. One evening near the end of summer, Elridge heard someone moving near his shed. He took a lamp and went out. He saw a man standing in the shadow of the trees, thin and dark and wrong in a way that was not about skin. Elridge did not shout. He did not run. He said, "You're hurt." The man did not answer. Elridge took a step closer and saw the way one shoulder did not quite belong to the rest of the body anymore. He said, "You can't stand there long." The man looked at him. Elridge felt something move in his chest, not fear, recognition. He said, "Come inside." The man followed him. Elridge gave him water. The man drank like he did not remember when he had last done that. Elridge gave him bread. The man ate slowly. Elridge said, "They say you're a ghost." The man did not answer. Elridge said, "They say you're a devil." The man did not answer. Elridge said, "They say you're a lot of things." The man looked at the floor. Elridge said, "I don't care what they say." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Elridge said, "What do you want?" The man thought about that. When he spoke, his voice was not what Elridge expected. It was rough, but not loud. It sounded like it had not been used much. "I want it to stop," he said. Elridge said, "It doesn't look like it's stopping." The man shook his head. "Not like this." Elridge said, "Then how?" The man did not answer that. He stayed 2 days. Elridge cleaned his wounds as well as he could. They did not talk much. On the second night, Elridge asked, "How many?" The man did not answer. Elridge said, "They say 200. The man closed his eyes. Elridge said, "They say more." The man said very quietly, "They don't know." On the third morning, the man stood up and put his weight on his bad shoulder and did not fall. Elridge said, "Where are you going?" The man said, "Away." Elridge said, "They'll keep coming." The man said, "I know." Elridge said, "You can't do this forever." The man looked at him, foe. A moment Elridge thought he was going to smile. He did not. "I'm not trying to," the man said. Before he left, he said one more thing. "They will never chain this land again." Elridge did not understand that until later. After that, the killings came closer together, not in place, in time. Sometimes 2 in a day, sometimes 3, sometimes nothing for a week, and then 5 in a night. The state began to lose track. It did not admit that, but it began to show. Patrols overlapped and left gaps. Men were sent to places that had already been searched. Men were not sent to places that needed it. The boy moved through the cracks. The number reached 230, then 240. The newspapers stopped printing numbers entirely. They printed words like many and numerous and several. People wrote the numbers in the margins. There was a night when a camp of 12 was found empty except for one man who had lost his mind and could not say what he had seen. There was a morning when a road was closed, because 4 bodies were found in places where there should not have been. Even one, the boy did not know he was nearing the end. He only knew that he was tired in a way that had nothing left to give. He took fewer risks. He also took fewer men at a time. The land began to feel smaller. Then, one night, he took 3 from a patrol near a place where the river bends and the trees make a dark ceiling. That made 250. No one announced it, but everyone felt it. After that, there were no more. Not that anyone could prove. There were rumors. There always are. But the shape of it changed. The state waited. The towns waited. The woods waited. And the boy did not come back. Elridge lived another 10 years. He never told his story until he was old enough to believe that telling it did not matter anymore. When he did, he always ended the same way. He would say, "He didn't say he was going to die. He would say he didn't say he was going to keep killing. He would say he said he was going away. And then he would add, and I believed him. For a long time, nothing happened. That was the first thing people noticed. Not that no one died. People always die. But the pattern that had bent the land around itself for years simply stopped. Patrols still walked. Camps still stood. Checkpoints still checked. But weeks went by without a disappearance that could not be explained in ordinary ways. Then months. The state did not declare victory. It did not declare anything. It waited the way institutions wait, which is to say it continued to exist and hoped that existence would be mistaken for resolution. The towns waited too. They waited in smaller ways. They waited to send their sons back onto roads that had become rumors. They waited to fish stretches of river that had learned to keep secrets. They waited to believe that the woods had gone back to being only woods. Some of them never did. Elridge died in the winter, and with him went the last living person who could say he had seen the man up close and spoken to him and watched him walk away. When Elridge was buried, there were 3 men at the grave who had once been soldiers, and 2 who had once been slaves, and 1 who had once been both. No one said anything that mattered. Years passed. The story did not. It changed the way all stories do when they are no longer anchored to a living voice. Some said the man had been shot and crawled into a hole and died there. Some said he had crossed the river and gone north. Some said he had gone deeper into the hills and found a place where even the land did not follow itself. Some said he had never been one man at all. The state kept looking, quietly, not with armies, with paper, with clerks who read old reports and tried to line up dates and places, with men who walked old ground and compared it to newer maps, with questions that were asked and then written, down and then put away. 10 years after the last killing, a survey team was sent to redraw parts of the hill country. The land had been burned and walked and cut again. Roads had changed. Rivers had shifted their edges. What had once been guesses on maps were now supposed to become lines. One of the surveyors was a woman named Hale who did not care about the story. That is why she found something. She noticed that 3 different maps, from 3 different years, did not agree on a small region, where the hills fold in on themselves like a closing hand. On one map, it was a blank. On another, it was marked as impassable. On a third, it had a creek that did not exist anywhere else. She went there because it was her job to make the land make sense. It did not, the place was not large, a day's walk across at most, but it felt wrong in a way that did not come from superstition. Paths bent slightly, distances did not behave. A ridge that should have been a single climb became 3. Her team camped at the edge of it and went in the morning. They came back out before noon and did not talk about why. Hale went in alone the next day. She was not brave. She was stubborn. The hills there are not tall, but they are crowded. Rock breaks through the soil in long slanted plates. Trees grow where they should not and do not grow where they should. The ground holds water in places that look dry and gives it up in places that look wet. She walked for hours and began to suspect she was walking in a shape instead of a direction. She found the creek. It was real, it was also wrong. It flowed uphill for a short distance before disappearing into stone. She followed it. She came to a place where the rock opens into something like a bowl, and then narrows again into a passage that is not quite a cave and not quite a corridor. Light comes in from above in thin, slanted lines. The ground is smooth in a way that means it has been walked on. There were signs of old fires, not recent, not ancient either. There were marks on the rock that could have been made by knives. There were places where someone had stacked stones and then unstacked them again. There was no body, there were no bones, there was no proof. But Hale stood there for a long time and felt as if she was standing in the footprint of something that had once been very heavy. She did not write any of this in her report. She wrote that the region was difficult to map and recommended that the existing boundaries be left as they were. The story did not care about her report. It kept going. In some versions, the man became a spirit of the woods. In others, he became a soldier who had simply chosen the wrong war. In others, he became a warning told to children who did not understand what they were being warned about. But in the towns along the river, there were still old men who had been young once, and they remembered the shape of fear, and they remembered the shape of a quiet that means something is not finished. One of them, a man who had lost a brother in the 3rd year of the killings, went back into the hills when he was too old to be useful for anything else. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He took a week's worth of food and a walking stick and a small knife. that he did not believe he would use. He walked for 3 days and then found himself in a place he did not recognize, even though he had been born not far from there. He felt watched, not in a way that made him afraid, in a way that made him careful. On the 4th day he came to a place where the ground leveled. He waited until evening. Nothing happened. He waited until morning. Nothing happened. He left and did not go back. He did not tell anyone what he had found. He only said that he thought the hills were bigger than people believed. The state closed the last of the camps. Roads reopened. Trade returned. Children grew up without learning to be quiet for the same reasons their parents had. But the woods did not become only woods again. Not entirely. Because every few years, someone would vanish in a way that did not fit. Not a soldier, not a patrol, just someone who had gone somewhere they should not have and did not come back. And there would be no pattern. And there would be no number. And that was worse, in some ways. Hale lived long enough to become a department head and then retired. When she was old, she went through her old papers and found the map that did not agree with itself and tried to remember why she had kept it. She could not, she burned it. The fire did not care. There is no grave for the man who began at Walker Estate and ended 250 lives later. There is no marker. There is no agreed-upon place where he fell. There is only a region where maps are still uncertain and stories still do not settle. Some say he died of his wounds in a place no one has found. Some say he crossed into a part of the land that does not belong to anyone. Some say he simply became what the woods needed him to be and then stopped being visible. The truth is smaller and larger than all of these. He was a man. He was also a shape that a time and a place made, because that time and that place refused to be anything else. And when he was finished, he did not leave a body. He left a question. Not did he die, but what happens to a world that teaches someone to become that? The river still runs, the hills still stand, the woods still listen, and every so often when the light is wrong and the wind is quiet, someone will stand at the edge of those trees and feel, without knowing why, that some stories do not end, they only move.